Hi, everybody. This is Jasmine McAdams, Program Officer from the Center of Partnerships and Innovation. Thank you for being here today for the joint working group between the EVs and the PBR working groups. Today we have a very exciting panel, and I'd like to introduce them now. So we have Commissioner Maria Bocanegra from Illinois, who will be moderating today's discussion, and our panelists, Megan Anderson from the Regulatory Assistance Project, Ed Burgess from the Vehicle Grid Integration Council, and Sudhakara from Edison, who will be leading a discussion about opportunities for PBR in transportation electrification. And before you get started, I wanted to introduce the agenda. So we'll have our speakers, after roll call, we'll have our speakers go into their presentations, and then we'll leave about 10 minutes for audience Q&A, followed by a closed door discussion with our working group members. And you should have received an email a few days ago with the discussion questions already lined up. So please be ready to contribute and be a part of the discussion. And then I'll have Carrie go ahead and help facilitate the roll call, and I will pull up the map just to see who's here.
Great, thanks. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the joint EV and PBR working group meeting. I will run through the roster, and please just chat in if we have made a mistake in your affiliation or anything else as I go through this. So I will start at the top. Al Freeman from Michigan, thanks for being here. Amanda Best from Maryland. Andrew Rector from Washington. Anita Castledine from Nevada. Commissioner Rendall from Washington. Ashley Rencor from Illinois. Byron Murray from Missouri. Commissioner Carrie Zalewski from Illinois. Thanks, Illinois, for being here. Let's see, Commissioner Manthe from Nevada, Danielle Fuss-Burnett from Neighboring Staff, our Center for Partnerships and Innovation Director, David Budig from Missouri, thanks, Missouri. David Tansable from EPA, thanks, David, for being here. Deanne Walker from Texas. Deborah Bernstein from Missouri. Sabria Twillinger from Nevada. Emily Leshka from Massachusetts. Andrea Frazier from DC. Eric Sherman from Oregon. Hannah Twillinger from Minnesota, Jamie Barber from Georgia, Jenna Merrill from Illinois. All right, keep it going here. There's 44 of y'all folks here, and if you wanted to, you can view under the drop-down, you can see your fellow attendees. So I'll keep going. Jenny Board from Delaware, Joe Fontaine from Wisconsin, John Kudak from Georgia, Karen Olesky from Nevada, Kelly Martone from Minnesota, Kim Lighthart from Nevada, Kristen Abbott from Texas, Leo Asuncion from Hawaii, Commissioner Asuncion, Lindsay Weiner from New York, Mara McClellan from Ohio, Patrick Hudson from Michigan, Peter Capers from Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, Brian LaRue from Michigan, Saeed Dindarlu from Missouri, Sarah Freeman from Indiana, Commissioner Freeman, Sarah Lane from Missouri, Shannon Withenshaw from Michigan, Shelby Enschler from Florida, Sherry Coughlin from Wisconsin, Steve Shorm from Oregon, Tanya Burns from aurablueenergy.com, Tremaine Phillips, Commissioner Phillips from Michigan, and Zorai Hagos from New York. And, excuse me, Tanya Burns is with DOE. Thanks. And that's it. Thank you all for being here. It seems like a great mix of EV and PBR, and thanks, Jasmine, for tracking our folks on the map. That was fun to see. Jasmine?
Great. Thank you so much. And first, we'll have Megan Anderson from RAP. So Megan, you're good to go.
Thank you, Jasmine, and good afternoon to everybody. My name is Megan Anderson, and I'm an associate with the Regulatory Assistance Project. And I just wanted to first thank the EV and PBR working groups for the invitation to be here today. I was excited to hear about the combination of these groups in this webinar, and I'm happy to talk about a report that we put together on using PBR for electric vehicle integration. So next slide, please. So as a sort of initial matter, oh, I think, yep, there we go. So the next one, please. Thank you. I first wanted to start with just saying how EVs present both great opportunities for the power sector and also the potential for challenges when they're not managed well. And as a result, it really presents an area where the benefits of PBR can be seen very well, and we can really use it to its best purposes for EV integration. Next slide, please. So first, just a few thoughts about the opportunity of integrating EVs. The transportation sector is now the largest share of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. Light-duty vehicles make up the majority of the share, and together with medium and heavy-duty trucks make up 82% of these emissions. There is therefore a great opportunity to reduce US GHG emissions in the transportation sector. Next slide, please. EVs also present a great opportunity for grid integration because we don't actually use our cars that much when you look at the hours. Cars sit parked for the vast majority of the hours in a week or month or year, and the hours we need to charge those EVs to be ready to take us where we need to go is also a small fraction of the car's resting hours. In short, we have a lot of opportunity to charge EVs at opportune times. That said, if the wrong incentives exist, or if no incentives exist at all, it is possible that limited charging hours might occur at times when they could exacerbate peak demands or use power that is not coming from our most efficient or cleanest sources. Next slide, please. So in short, EVs present both an opportunity and also a risk. I noted at one of the panels at this November's NARUC meeting that there was a lot of discussion regarding EVs and the need for proper signals to ensure that EVs were adding to the grid. So it's really a timely topic and one that I hope this presentation can add to. So the next question is, how do we ensure that these EVs are really accomplishing this goal that we would like for them? So the next slide, please. As I noted before, when talking about EVs and PBR, I kind of want to say that performance-based regulation is the way that we can do this with like trumpets blaring or something, because I feel like that using PBR to address EV integration can not only allow regulators to get ahead of the issue, it can provide opportunities for creative solutions that I'll discuss a little bit later. But it really just highlights both how EVs can be used and how PBR can be used and the combination of the two together. Next slide, please. So first, I wanted to start with a quick overview of PBR, and after hearing the roll call and knowing that a lot of you are already working on this issue, this is going to be pretty basic, but it's maybe a little bit of level setting for the rest of the presentation in any event. So PBR provides a regulatory framework for regulators to first develop goals and then to align utility incentives with those goals instead of sending the utilities mixed messages. For example, we send a mixed message often of, yes, we want to decarbonize, but we're still going to rely on cost of service regulation that incentivizes the utility for investments in capital projects on the ground instead of using demand side resources or energy efficiency, for example, which might enable a more optimized energy system. Next slide, please. A well-designed PBR framework, by contrast, can address the CapEx bias and the throughput incentive, benefiting customers and utility shareholders alike. PBR can motivate the utility to do good things that are not profitable under the status quo regulation, like promoting cost-effective distributed resources, such as EVs. It can also motivate the utility to not do bad things, like gold plating assets, by which I mean investing in whatever solution adds the most to rate base and shareholder returns, even if it is more costly to customers. And PBR can be tailored to address some of the hidden perverse incentives in the status quo regulation, like the incentive to keep costs low, for example, leading to minimizing tree trimming expenses or those sorts of things. Next slide, please. So there are several steps to developing performance-based regulation. I'm going to say up front that these get divided up and named differently by different entities. And RAP is guilty here too sometimes. So the ideas are all the same, and I'll go through each one of these steps briefly. Next slide, please. So the first step in designing performance-based regulation is to set guiding goals for what you want to achieve. These are usually goals enshrined in or informed by the applicable public policy priorities of the jurisdiction. The goals noted here will track throughout my description of the rest of the steps. I have used one more traditional goal, the first goal of here making or keeping energy affordable for customers. And then I have also used one related to EVs as an example. So here it's increase efficient EV charger deployment. Note that these are usually very high-level aspirational goals at this point without any numbers, and that the specifics come later. Next slide, please. So one thing we've really found in working with states is that before going further, it's a good idea to think about how the status quo creates incentives or disincentives for achieving goals. Is the status quo working, or would new incentives be helpful? And this is the step where you might think about whether the CapEx bias, the throughput incentive, or even the decoupling mechanism is helping or hindering achievement of your goals. Or maybe there's already some performance incentives, such as for energy efficiency savings. So it's helpful to understand these things before creating new performance incentives that won't work in the current regulatory framework, or that send mixed signals, or that reward the utility twice for the same activity. In one state where I recently worked on a PBR proceeding, we developed a paper that spelled out some of the existing regulatory frameworks so that the status quo we are working with was clear for the regulators, utilities, and stakeholders. And I found that to be a very useful process in that PBR proceeding. Next slide, please. So moving on to developing measurable criteria. Once the goals are set and you've reviewed the current incentives, it's important to develop measurable performance criteria that can show you if you've achieved the goals. Performance criteria are expressed as measurable outcomes. So if the guiding goal is to make energy more affordable, our first goal, then the performance criterion could be to measure whether customer bills are declining. If the goal is to increase EV charger deployment, our second goal, then the performance criterion could be to track charger infrastructure deployment and usage. Next slide, please. So then the next step is to create metrics, and performance metrics translate the performance criteria into very specific things that can be measured transparently and without controversy about their interpretation. So that's a key design principle. So for the performance criteria of declining customer bills, which again was our first goal here, you might track average monthly energy bills for residential customers. For the EV charging infrastructure goal, the metric could be to track which charging hosts are using incentives and require those hosts to provide information about the usage of those sites. Next slide, please. The next step in designing performance metrics is to establish targets. So a couple slides before, please, to the big arrow. In short, we don't just want to track these goals, we want to set targets that we want to see if incentives are working to achieve what we want to see happening. So for the affordability example, perhaps our target is a 2% reduction in average monthly residential bills. And for charging stations, maybe it's a target of a 5% improvement in charging stations and charging station utilization. These are fairly random numbers. Probably we want much more, but this is just to demonstrate the specificity that you want in creating those metrics. So the next slide, please. The last step of the PBR process is to think about how you will track this utility performance. We've seen states adopt a variety of approaches. Some states just track utility performance on the metrics and share the data publicly on a dashboard website. Publicizing this utility performance might be as far as you want to go if you have no previous work with performance metrics or trying out new metrics. The next step up is to compare or rank the performance of utilities against each other on a public website. We've seen this approach used in the United Kingdom and Denmark. And the third option would be to not only publicize performance metrics, but to also tie them to financial incentives. Next slide, please. So now I want to get in to provide an overview of the work we did on our paper on PBR and EV integration. Next slide, please. So in that paper, we first, oops, I think the previous slide, yeah, there we go. Or just want to check to make sure. Yes, I think it's just showing up a little differently. So the first step in this applying PBR to EV integration that we looked at in the paper was to set forth some threshold questions about what regulators might want to ask before getting into the specifics of the process to inform their goals for EV integration. We came up with quite a long list in our paper, and this is just a few, there are just a few examples here, but some ideas might be, what are the carbon and pollution reduction goals of the jurisdiction? Are there any goals supporting EV build out? And what are the goals of those EV build out? Is it to serve customers, for EV opportunities in underserved communities, or for grid stability? And another question was, what education and outreach activities are most helpful for agencies, utilities, car dealerships, car manufacturers, and other entities? So regulators can use the answers to these questions to inform how they will approach their goals for a PBR process. Next slide, please. The next step, and I noted this briefly before, is we also considered what data might be useful to inform this process. And looking at this in one state, we discovered that information that might be useful to the PBR process might be housed in various reports and might not be neatly laid out or apparent for regulators starting a process. So a first step might be to consider determining what information regulators already have access to and what they might need to acquire as part of the process, or in what format they might want that data presented as part of the process. This is a step that can occur both before and during a PBR process. It is helpful to assess what data is there, but PBR can also help with acquiring more data. First, it can provide a means by which regulators can require the tracking of data on progress towards critical goals in successful EV integration. And second, it can require utilities to develop data on the effectiveness of steps to meet those goals, including the cost effectiveness of investments and tariffs. So it can probably, and it's probably going to end up being an iterative process for regulators. So next slide, please. In our paper, we took basically three goals for EV integration as example of how PBR might be used to achieve them. And those are listed here. And I think these are great EV goals, but these are, again, just illustrative of what we did in the paper and just examples. Next slide, please. So for each goal, we then use that example to develop more specific goals that would likely stem from the broader goal, performance criteria to meet those goals, and metrics that could be used to measure achievement. So here's just a sample again, and I'll go through each one of these goals with some examples, but in the paper there are many more goals and performance criteria and metrics that we developed if you want to take a look at it there. So for one example, one sub-goal of building EV charging cost benefits and consumer savings might be to increase customer awareness of EV charging rates. An example of performance criteria for that goal might be that utilities have to provide customers information on those rates through multiple channels of communication. And then a survey or usage of the rates could then be used to determine awareness of those rates. So this is kind of how it gets distilled down into those final metrics. Next slide, please. Our second goal that we used as an example was to encourage the development of EV infrastructure while controlling costs. And we went through a similar exercise for each of these goals, as I noted. So here the performance criteria can include measuring the effectiveness of incentives for use of existing infrastructure, and then metrics might include tracking the use of those incentives to use existing infrastructure, such as where charging infrastructure use light poles or telecommunication poles or similar existing infrastructure. And next slide, please. And our final goal was to use existing grid resources to integrate EV load to maximize net benefits to all ratepayers. So for example, another sub-goal we came up with for that larger goal was to do so by decreasing investment in generation or distribution system upgrades. A performance criteria might be to evaluate utility hosting capacity and then to determine optimal charging locations. Benefits to ratepayers can be maximized where EVs are integrated in a manner that takes advantage of the flexibility they can add to the grid. And EVs can be used to decrease investment in generation, minimize distribution system upgrades, and maximize the use of existing infrastructure, all of which can reduce costs to ratepayers. So to sum up a little bit here, I know these goals can really take those considerations into account and develop ways that we're incentivizing utilities to meet those goals, and really take advantage of the flexibility that EVs can add to the grid. Next slide, please. So this was a very brief summary of our paper, but here's a link to it in this slide deck that I'm guessing will be shared, and those are all hyperlinks as well to other work we've done on this topic. And feel free as well to contact me for copies of any of these or for more information about any of our work. Next slide, please. And that is it for my presentation. Thank you again for inviting me to join today, and I look forward to questions after the other presenters.
Great. Thank you, Megan.
All right, this is Commissioner Bocanegra. I apologize. I was trying to unmute myself. It looks like next up we have Ed Burgess with Vehicle Grid Integration Council. Whenever
Yes,
you're ready.
can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you for the opportunity to present with you today. And just before I begin, I wanted to just make a quick note that although I was introduced as the part of the Vehicle Grid Integration Council, which I do in fact lead, I also wear a different hat as a consultant because VGIC is operated by STRATEGEN Consulting, and I'll first be sharing my perspective based on some of my experience consulting on EV issues, and then I'll weave in some of the Vehicle Grid Integration Council or VGIC relevant issues later in my presentation. Can you go to the next slide, please? Just a quick blurb about STRATEGEN. We're a professional services firm with a few different practice areas. Within our consulting practice, we have a team of experts that frequently participate as witnesses in PUC proceedings on issues including distributed generation and rate design, resource and grid planning, and various regulatory reform and innovation issues, including performance-based regulation. Next slide, please. For what I want to cover today, first I want to present a case study, which is an illustrative example for Massachusetts, where I've seen firsthand some of the crossover between transportation electrification and performance-based regulation and some of the lessons learned from that experience. Second, I want to then zoom out and consider some of the high-level issues of transportation electrification in the PBR context. And then finally, I want to pivot to some thoughts on a few leading edge issues that we're seeing in California that I think could warrant some further consideration under a PBR framework, either there or in other states. Next slide, please. So to first dive into this illustrative example from Massachusetts, we participated, I was retained by the Massachusetts Attorney General to work with them on the National Grid rate case in 2019, the case filed in 2018. And under this case, National Grid had proposed a new PBR framework, and as part of that proposal had included two performance incentive mechanisms that were tied to National Grid's transportation electrification efforts. The two mechanisms they proposed, one was an EV adoption PIM, and that was to provide a reward-only incentive to the company based on achieving a higher incremental level of EV adoption than a baseline that had been forecasted. The second was a cost containment incentive mechanism that was also a reward-only incentive to the company for delivering EV infrastructure at below the company estimated cost projections. Go to the next slide, please. On behalf of the Attorney General, we presented testimony in this case and really offered a critique of these performance incentive mechanisms that were being proposed. Regarding the EV adoption PIM, this again was sort of an upside-only mechanism linked to the broad market trend of EV adoption and there was really no downside we could detect if those projections were not met for EV adoption. Additionally, we felt that there were many factors outside of the utility's control on this, including the availability of EV models, the purchase price of those vehicles, additional government incentive programs, and so on. Furthermore, there weren't really any plans to act where the utility did seem to have control. For example, the company testified that they didn't have any specific plan for making a time of use or other EV-specific rate proposal. Finally, we also felt there was other existing incentives for utilities to pursue EV adoption. And so those are some of our critiques of that. Regarding the cost containment incentive mechanism, this was a mechanism that was basically looking at how the costs came in relative to a baseline, which was relying upon a company-generated projection of those EVSE investment costs. Our critique of this was a better approach would actually be to track some of the real-world cost data that was coming in from the early phase of their transportation electrification plan, and really to try to track it closer to what some of the real-world data was showing rather than these projections. The result in this case was that the DPU did reject these incentive mechanisms. And the reason I present this is because I think this reflects a cautionary tale for how certain EV-related incentive proposals could come about. And I think there's some lessons learned about other ways we could think about incentives in relation to transportation electrification that may be a little more productive and perhaps a little more in line with where the utility can have some control and where the benefits really can be generated on the grid. So can you go to the next slide, please? And so this brings me to the next slide, where I want to sort of zoom out a little bit and think about what is the role of some of these types of performance incentive mechanisms in this context of transportation electrification, and vice versa. And so, one important thing to think about is what are the utility incentives that already exist for transportation electrification, and that's shown on the left-hand side of this slide. And you can see there that some of the ones that we have in mind are that there's potential for increased margin of sales from new EV load relative to a test year. There may be CapEx opportunities, investment opportunities to deploy new charging stations that are utility-owned equipment or make-ready upgrades on the distribution system. There may also be larger investment opportunities related to the new demand that EVs present to the grid, and in the form of distribution system upgrades, as well as even new generation to meet that peak demand. In contrast, so the point being, there's already incentives that exist, and the question is, if we're going to be developing new incentives, how do we contrast those, and what should they be targeting? And that's what's shown really on the right-hand side. The new incentives that I think would be appropriate, in conjunction with transportation electrification, would be things like, how are the EVSE equipment being utilized? Is it being, are there high utilization for some of these equipment? Is there effective managed charging solutions being implemented that can sort of effectively reduce that megawatt system load? Are there, how are we doing in terms of customers participating in specific EV rates or programs? And then could there be some sort of shared savings mechanism to the extent that we can limit some of the investments in the distribution system upgrades through things like automated load management? If you envision, there could be charging locations with multiple EVs, and there are software and hardware solutions being developed to sort of throttle the charging to some degree, and that can actually minimize the need to put in certain types of upgrade equipment. And so with those savings, there could be a way to reward both the installer, but also the utility for taking that approach. Finally, how there could be vehicle to grid solutions, and those require interconnection requests and are those being processed in an effective and efficient manner? So the common theme for a lot of these new incentives is how can utilities leverage EVs as a grid asset to lower overall system costs? And go to the next slide, please. I want to shift gears now a little bit, and taking this this core concept, some of the lessons from the work we've been doing on behalf of the Grid Integration Council in California. And I want to start with the question is, why is it important to incent utilities to leverage EVs as grid assets? And I think the answer is because, as Megan had mentioned, they present both a challenge in the form of new cost pressures and an opportunity in potential cost savings. This slide shows one forecast of what the hourly load shape of these EVs might look like in California. And what you can see is that sort of under this business as usual approach, the load fits squarely on the evening peak that we're seeing in that sort of 3 p.m. to 10 p.m. range. And so the question is, could we reimagine a situation where this chart is reversed, charging in off-peak and avoiding charging or even discharging during that evening peak? And utilities, I think, are uniquely positioned to deploy some of the tools to encourage this behavior through things like that I mentioned on the last slide, like time of use rates, customer programs like demand response targeted towards EVs, customer engagement tools, and really encouraging a suite of grid services, managed V1G charging, and eventually vehicle to grid or V2G. Now, utilities may not be naturally inclined to do this, and that's why I think PBR tools could come in handy for trying to sort of track the performance on these issues and perhaps link them to some type of a reward. Next slide, please. By some estimates, there's tremendous value in this. Some recent studies in California have showed that there could be in the billions of potential savings from these types of services if we shift load, through V1G resources, or ultimately get to V2G to use the capabilities of these vehicles on the system. There's some numbers here on the slide that represent some of those studies that folks can take a look at. And this, the hope is that this also would potentially translate into meaningful benefits for EV customers if they're able to capture some of that value as well. I will note that the CPUC recently stood up a VGI working group, which issued its final report earlier this year. One of their recommendations among a long list is shown here, which was to institute performance-based rate making to encourage more efficient electric vehicle related distribution build out. So, there is some sense that, there's a linkage between these areas, and I think that, that can certainly be further developed as we move forward with these transportation electrification efforts. If you go to the next slide, please. And I just want to conclude now with a concept that we introduced in California as part of the overarching transportation electrification proceeding, which was, could there be a way to encourage utilities to develop what we're calling a VGI portfolio as a complement to broader transportation electrification plans? While this is still a concept, we envision this approach could include a variety of elements, ranging from using EVs as a demand response resource to the automated load management solutions that I spoke about earlier, participation in dynamic or time of use rates, looking at EVs as a potential resilience use case where they could provide backup power in certain types of outage events, and really layering on additional grid services as we deploy the infrastructure. Certain charging stations could be used to implement things like ancillary services, and so on and so forth. And you know, the idea here is that the performance of the elements within this portfolio could be tracked over time, things like megawatt savings or customer participation, and then ultimately, you know, these could be linked to some type of a performance-based regulation or multi-year rate plan framework in the manner that I think Megan articulated well in her presentation. And so if you can just please go to the next slide. So that concludes what I wanted to share today. Here's my contact information for Strategen. And if you go to the next slide, there's a little more information too about the Vehicle Grid Integration Council. And you know, we would certainly be very excited to continue to engage with NARUC on a variety of issues, including PBR, interconnection, and so on and so forth. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Ed. That was very interesting. So last but not least, we have Raghusimha with Con Ed. Raghu, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. You can hear me, right?
Yes, we can.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Raghusimha with Con Edison. Really a delight to be here with you all. I think Megan and Ed covered a lot of the points on performance-based regulation, so I'll be relatively brief as I go through, but the way sort of I structured this for the talk today is to go over some high-level PBR concepts, things that have worked in New York, and then sort of the application in the clean transportation space or for the electric vehicle space. If you could go to the next slide, please. Great. So if you sort of see the goals of performance-based regulation more generally in the country and overseas as well, really the idea is to somehow have the utilities change behavior in order to exceed some sort of a business as usual case. And some of the things that we've seen that PBR can encourage is policy achievements. You know, most recently, decarbonization is a big focus. Market enablement is a key area as well, where there's an interest in developing a robust network of third-party actors in different service areas and different states in order to have that market ecosystem, if you will, that generates more favorable policy outcomes. Thirdly, just want to emphasize both innovation and efficiency, and really what we mean by that here is encouraging utilities to take more risk. It's a more risk-averse industry, and also to focus on things that there might not be a natural incentive for, and others have talked about it, such as cost efficiency or efficiency of benefits, which is to maximize benefits. Fourth, I think this is really important too. I think PBR is really very effective when it really elicits an enterprise-wide focus at utility, and I'll talk a little bit about what makes that focus show up in the utility organizations. And lastly, and definitely not the least, to enable more customer benefits. If you sort of see on the right, do have many areas where performance-based regulation has been applied. Some are very specific, like energy efficiency and distributed energy resources, and some are more general, like peak reduction and equity and inclusion. And all of these, I think the key, and you heard this from the last two presenters, is to have a thoughtful approach as to what will really move the outcomes or move the needle towards the outcomes. Just want to conclude this slide by saying performance incentives we have seen do drive higher achievement, and there's no better example for that than in the energy efficiency space. And we just put a site down there for an ACEEE paper that talks about incentives and the result they have, and I will talk a little more about the effect it had at Con Ed as well in New York before going off into electric vehicles. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I just want to talk a little bit about performance-based regulation, and I apologize that the focus here is a little bit more on New York, given where Con Edison service area is. For us, PBR shows up through what's called EAMs, sorry, another acronym that I'm introducing here, and that's earnings adjustment mechanisms. And these have evolved since 2016 when Con Ed had its first set of EAMs, and really focus on driving societal value and driving achievement. And when I say achievement, achievement above business as usual. So really, when we talk about societal value, we're really talking about the social benefit cost or societal benefit cost analysis framework that we have here. And so really creating a lot more societal benefits than the costs, including the costs of EAMs themselves, you know, any payouts that are made to the utility. Second, I think an important focus and certainly an important focus from a utility perspective is that it has to represent a meaningful opportunity for utilities. And that's because if the EAM is at a level that's sufficient to motivate and drive utilities, that's when you achieve the change of behavior, the enterprise-wide focus that really drives those outcomes. Secondly, just as important is it has to be the targets. Once the metrics are set, I think Megan did a really good job talking about the process of getting to a performance metric. But once the metric has been set, the target needs to be at a level that's within the realm of achievability, because if it's far and above stretch, then the motivation to really achieve just goes away. And if it's far too easy, then again, you probably do not have as much benefits as you can extract out of that particular policy mechanism. Lastly, I just want to emphasize it's about achieving the policy smartly. Both Ed and Megan talked about some principles. I think, you know, and outlined some here and some at the very end. EAMs or PBR should not be so broad that, you know, the utility is completely unable to influence result and it's more subject to macroeconomic or outside factors, but also not so narrow and so focused that it really hampers innovation. And when I say innovation, meaning utilities bringing all the tools in their toolbox to bear, including many creative out-of-the-box tools in order to drive a certain outcome. We also think EAMs or PBR should be structured in a way that's periodic, annually. So there is that constant goal and constant focus on achievement, but then also really focus on practical execution is just as important. And I'll just give you a very quick example here. In energy efficiency, we have a deeper energy efficiency goal that's a multi-year EAM, so where if you're not fully able to achieve above business as usual, but up to the maximum level in any given year, you could move that to the following year. And this encourages us to do multi-year projects, for example, that would be very expensive and very tough. And you know, for example, the building envelope improvements. Lastly, also want these PBR to change only incrementally, because utilities build up the institutional capability to drive that achievement. And if there are dramatic shifts, you know, for instance, from rate case to rate case, then again, the process has to start all over again, and it takes a while to build that expertise, the institutional capability to move markets. If you move to the next slide, please. So I just want to very quickly highlight the Con Edison experience with PBR in energy efficiency. I talked about some of the things that you see on the left when we first got the EAMs for energy efficiency in New York for Con Edison. Really changed how we fast-tracked innovation, really changed the focus that we showed towards achievement, how we redesigned our processes, how we organized our department around achievements, and the kinds of talent that we dedicated towards the effort. And really, you know, the proof that the EAMs and the structure that New York put together, the policy that New York put together works is really on the right. Our energy efficiency tripled between 2016 and 2019, and our costs dropped by 25%. And also the peak megawatt savings also quadrupled in that same period. And really between now and the next 2 or 3 years, we're looking to double or triple our energy efficiency again. And this process in between 2016 and 2019 created over $400 million of net new benefits. So if there's a good poster child from our perspective of a successful EAM policy that drove achievement, this is one. If you go to the next slide, please. Yeah, I want to conclude with this, the PBR framework that can drive achievement in clean transport. Just want to take a minute to sort of explain the 2 EAMs that we currently have in New York for electric vehicles. There's one which calling here program-based, because this is based on the Make Ready program that New York authorized earlier this year. And this is really focused on both overachievement at below cost that was authorized. And again, here it's the share the savings model, and really the metric here is 30% of savings below budget. And I say below budget here, but really it could also be overachievement. And the incentive, you see BPS, which is really basis points, because in New York, EAMs are based on basis points. Separately, there's an outcome-based beneficial electrification EAM that looks at increasing heat pump adoption and EV adoption by looking through the metric of the greenhouse gas reductions, which is up to 10 basis points. Again, the program-based, a lot more utility control. It's the program that was authorized specifically to deliver charging infrastructure. The outcome-based is really to be even more creative, use all the tools in the toolbox, like I was talking about, and drive GHG reduction by both EVs and heat pumps. So it's the general electrification goal. Some things that I do want to highlight is policy alignment is critical. I think both Megan and Ed talked really eloquently about EV and EV policies, but the one thing I do want to highlight here is when policies conflict with other policies, I think being thoughtful of and not getting siloed into a particular area, whether it be clean transport or electrification or peak reduction. And I'll just give one example. There's a lot of discussion about EV rates and demand charges associated with EV rates, but really the demand charges during peak hours are there for a reason, and that is to discourage very peaky load, like needle peak loads. And really when you try to move the needle in one side, you don't want to sort of affect other policy goals where you have programs such as demand response and non-wires alternatives that are specifically there for peak reduction, and then there is a different price signal that comes out of rates on the EV side that conflicts with other PBR. So I think understanding where the silos cross and being thoughtful about it is really important. And secondly, just want to say execution is really critical, understanding the execution. So really, we think any PBR should be informed by executability, not just achievability, but executability. So how can somebody implement it on the ground? And I say that because I have the responsibility for our team to implement the EV programs on the ground. And also looking at driving practical efficiency, whether it be costs or benefits. One example, a good example, is to sort of recognize the trajectory of growth, whether it be a slow adoption in the beginning and a more rapid adoption towards the end. Recognition of such variables and accommodation of that through PBR is going to be also really important in sort of making it meaningful to utilities and driving achievement. Some of the attributes that sort of a note on the right, I think others covered it as well, a very well-defined objective, measurable, and preferably avoids counterfactual. So there's not like a lack of clarity when you're measuring whether you actually achieved, that it's a stretch, but it's attainable, that it stays stable over time. And then it's time-based, but then is also adaptable as the market evolves. So that sort of concludes my part, my presentation here, and definitely open to any questions from anybody. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Raghu. This is Commissioner Bocanegra. I'll pause here, and I didn't see any questions in the questions section, but if anybody would like to ask a question out loud, please feel free to do so. I think Jasmine or Carrie, we can probably unmute someone if they were wanting to chat.
Yep, we can definitely do that. So if folks wanted to raise their hand, we could unmute them, or you could leave the question in the chat.
So Jasmine, while we're waiting, I did have a couple follow-up questions. I suppose they're more high level, and I guess really they're open to any of our guest speakers today. So the first question is, just on a very high level, how do each of you define vehicle grid integration? I think, Raghu, you had, or maybe it was Ed, who had the VGI portfolio, and I saw some ideas in there, but generally speaking, what are we talking about when we think about vehicle grid integration?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to answer that. This is Ed speaking. You know, we see, you know, vehicle grid integration as a broad set of tools that could, you know, unlock EVs as a grid resource, and that can range from, you know, there's sort of a continuum, you know, if you want to think about it in that sense, you know, from things like just simple, you know, time of use rates to more kind of sophisticated, you know, dynamic rate structures, and all the way up to kind of you know, vehicle to grid, where we can sort of even export power, you know, at peak times, and that's, you know, not really prevalent today, but, you know, there are some vehicles on the road that are bidirectional capable, and that's an area actively being developed in California, and other places as well. And so, you know, I see, you know, people often talk about, you know, managed charging, or sort of V1G and then V2G as kind of main categories, but I really see it as a broader set of tools as well, that includes those things, but it could also include things like, you know, the resilience and backup power issues we talked about. It could include the automated load management, where we're really targeting driving down costs on the distribution system, and some of those upgrades associated with charger build out. You know, there's a whole variety of things that could be kind of under this umbrella category that you know, we consider as VGI.
Thanks, Ed. Before we move on to our next question, did any of the other speakers want to jump in or have anything to add to that?
Yeah, Commissioner, this is Raghu. Just a very quick note. I just wanted to say, at least from the utility perspective, we think of VGI within the overall context of electrification, because when you are the utility delivering electricity, there is no color of electron. It's really who's using the electron and at what time. That's really what matters. And so we just see that then from the perspective of all the different types of load that's on the system and what their different capabilities are, whether it be just people consuming load for something, whether it be DERs, whether it be electric vehicles, and within the context of the technological capabilities of each of those to deliver from the broader perspective of better management of the grid. That's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Yeah. Just one additional note. This is Ed again. I mean, we would just also distinguish VGI as, you know, sort of a separate set of efforts in addition to you know, the underlying investments, you know, the charging infrastructure being made. This is sort of what can we do with that, you know, both the charging stations and the vehicles, you know, once they're there, you know, how can they perform again as a grid resource? And that's how at least we're envisioning that term VGI. And
to pile onto that a little bit, this is Megan. I think, you know, taking even a step back farther, I would say that we think of EV integration as really using EVs as one of the resources in this more dynamic grid that we're creating. So making sure that, and this is where I see PBR is really exciting in this space, because it's enabling us to look at EVs just like all of these other resources and how do we best use those for an optimized system.
So those are all great. Very interesting perspectives, but all very valid. We did have a question. This question's for Megan, or really any of the other presenters. Was there any other state, rather, besides New York that might serve as models for either some of the VGI and or PBR stuff that we have been talking about? And I guess we can start with Megan and then go from there.
I wish I had a really good inventory of what all the states are doing in PBR, and that may be out there somewhere. I know there are several states that are in the midst of PBR processes that are looking at EV ways to have EV goals and metrics, but I don't have any that are off the top of my head that I think are actually finalized or have been approved by the commissions there. But maybe Ed and Raghu have other examples.
Yeah, I wish I had a list too, Megan, but I don't think I can answer that off the top of my head. But I'd be happy to sort of look into it and get back to this group if that's of interest.
Yeah, the only, oh, sorry, I just want, the only, to pile on, I guess, again, the only thing I would add is the Illinois model for energy efficiency was an interesting one. And I think it might be Minnesota or Colorado. I have to just double check, but have a benefits-based model, because I know it's for Xcel Energy, and that's why I'm not sure which state that is, was also interesting when we were looking at the different PER regimes within the United States.
Hi, this is Hannah in Minnesota, and I can speak to the PBR metrics on EVs that Minnesota has adopted for Xcel Energy. And I think, Raghu, you might have the Xcel Colorado. They're in the process of perhaps adopting some, but in our comprehensive PBR doc, adopted 3. So one is the carbon dioxide emissions avoided by electrification of transportation using Xcel-specific average carbon dioxide intensity per kilowatt hour. We also did the percent of EVs participating in managed charging or time of use rates, and the percent of EV charging occurring in off-peak hours. There are no targets or incentives adopted. We're just getting the first kind of baseline metrics of this, and those will be reported in April of 2020.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah, for sharing that information. I guess I sort of had a similar question on the PBR side. You know, what if there's like a specific model, and also when I looked at the VGI portfolio slide that had been put up. So I guess in follow-up to that, how are these PBR metrics or financial incentives, how are they being introduced in the states that you have seen them? In other words, are these presented in a very separate proceeding initiated by a utility and or a commission, or are these through you know, traditional rate-making proceedings?
I can weigh in there. This is Megan. The way we've seen these discussed is in more comprehensive PBR proceedings that states are engaging in. So thanks, Hannah, for reminding me about, or reminding everybody about the Minnesota one. I couldn't remember if those had made it to the final list, but Minnesota had a very comprehensive PBR process where they brought in stakeholders and had a lot of good information that was presented and shared, and really a model, I think, for how to engage stakeholders in that type of proceeding. Nevada also has been in the midst of one that we've been involved in, which again, I think has been really great in the sense that it's been looking at various topics for potential, for PBR application potentially. And again, a place where there's been a lot of level setting information and baseline information that they've presented through stakeholder processes and publicly on their website, which is a great model, I think, for making sure that the different input is before the commission from stakeholders involved in those proceedings.
This is Ed. You know, in the example I presented in Massachusetts, the proposed incentives were part of the general rate case. And I think it's actually, you know, brings up an issue is that there's sort of, the way I see it, there's kind of a few different venues where these could be developed one being a general rate case, another being transportation electrification dockets, another being, PBR focused proceedings. So, that in some ways was the challenge in Massachusetts, is that, there was this sort of transportation electrification framework underway, which, to us felt like more the natural fit for these kind of proposals, rather than sort of putting them into a general rate case where there's a whole bunch of other, things being considered. And I don't have a clear recommendation on that, but I think it's something to be considering, is the timing and how these overlap with each other.
Right. Raghu, anything you want to share?
Nothing more to add. I'll just note that in New York, it's generally introduced to the rate cases, but we've also had some recommendations of structure through specific orders. At least so far, that's been the methodology we've adopted in New York. Okay, that's helpful. Well, I have one more question, and this is again from me, but I wanted to ask this because we have been doing some conversations around fleets and electrification, and one of the questions or ideas that kind of came up is this idea of like open access standards, if you will, where fleet owner operators can exchange information about, whatever integration plans they may have, and the utility likewise can share the same. Have you guys seen something like that come up in any of the either VGI or PBR proceedings, however they're being captioned?
Just could you maybe clarify what type of information is being exchanged here? I guess I wasn't quite clear on that.
So I think what we are hearing is that some of the concerns from fleet owner operators is, or vice versa, rather, let's say the utility would like to know, for example, the size of the fleet that they're planning to electrify. Perhaps they need to know their routes in order to determine where capacity might be needed. And likewise, fleet owner operators would like to know things like where are utilities, sourcing their generation for those fleets that are interested in, ensuring that the generation mix is, renewable. And so I guess generically the question is there any talk that you guys have seen in these proceedings about like exchanging that information or making something like that standardized?
This is Megan. I haven't seen that specific issue that I can remember in a proceeding come up, although it may have, and it's just my poor memory. But I definitely would say, in regard to sort of the general idea of what you're talking about, that's where I think some of these proceedings where they've really asked for a lot of stakeholder input and asked specific questions that the commission wanted more information on, or that came out of those stakeholder processes, to kind of get to some of that, what's the best way to share information, where can we align sort of the realities on the ground with the goals that we're trying to achieve. That exchange of information I've found is really useful in those proceedings where they're both, just we'll solicit a general comment from stakeholders, and then also specific questions being asked to make sure that the commissions are getting what they need out of those proceedings from the stakeholders involved.
Okay, that's very helpful. I was just curious. So it looks like we're at time. I will stop there and turn it back over to Jasmine for closing this portion of the presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Commissioner Bocanegra. And thank you so much to our speakers today for joining us. And I will let them go ahead and hop off the phone, but thank you so much for spending your time and being part of this discussion today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Great, and now we'll